2. Advice. Scene and situation are exactly as they were at the end of Act 1. The inspector remains at the door for a few moments, looking at Sheila and Gerald. Then he comes forward, leaving the door open behind him. Inspector to Gerald. Well? Sheila, with hysterical laugh to Gerald. You see? What did I tell you? Inspector. What did you tell him? Gerald with an effort. Inspector, I think Miss Burling ought to be excused. Any more of this questioning. She's nothing more to tell you. She's had a long, exciting and tiring day. We were celebrating our engagement, you know. And now, she's obviously had about as much as she can stand. You heard her. Sheila. He means that I'm getting hysterical now. Inspector. And are you? Sheila. Probably. Inspector. Well, I don't want to keep you here. I've no more questions to ask you. Sheila. No, but you haven't finished asking questions, have you? Inspector. No. Sheila to Gerald. You see? To Inspector. Then I'm staying. Gerald. Why should you? It's bound to be unpleasant and disturbing. Inspector. And you think young women ought to be protected against unpleasant and disturbing things? Gerald. If possible, yes. Inspector. Well, we know one young woman who wasn't, don't we? Gerald. I suppose I asked for that. Sheila. Be careful you don't ask for any more, Gerald. Gerald. I only meant to say to you, why stay when you'll hate it? Sheila. It can't be any worse for me than it has been, and might be better. Gerald bitterly. I see. Sheila. What do you see? Gerald. You've been through it, and now you want to see somebody else put through it. Sheila bitterly. So that's what you think I'm really like. I'm glad I realized it in time, Gerald. Gerald. No, I didn't mean. Sheila, continuing. Yes, you did. And if you really loved me, you couldn't have said that. You listened to that nice story about me. I got that girl sacked from Millwoods. And now, you've made up your mind I must obviously be a selfish, vindictive creature. Gerald. I neither said that nor even suggested it. Sheila. Then why say I want to see somebody else put through it? That's not what I meant at all. Gerald. All right then. I'm sorry. Sheila. Yes, but you don't believe me. And this is just the wrong time not to believe me. Inspector. Massively taking charge. Allow me, Miss Burling. To Gerald. I can't tell you why Miss Burling wants to stay on and why she says it might be better for her if she did. A girl died tonight. A pretty lively sort of girl who never did anybody no harm, but she died in misery and agony, hating life. Sheila, distressed. Don't please. I know, and I can't stop thinking about it. Inspector, ignoring this. Now Miss Burling has just made to understand what she did to this girl. She feels responsible, and if she leaves us now and doesn't hear any more, then she'll feel she's entirely to blame. She'll be alone with her responsibility the rest of tonight, all tomorrow, all the next night. Sheila, eagerly. Yes, that's it. And I know I'm to blame, and I'm desperately sorry. But I can't believe, I won't believe, it's simply my fault, that in the end, she committed suicide. That would be too horrible. Inspector, sternly turned to them both. You see, we have to share something. If there's nothing else, we'll have to share our guilt. Sheila, staring at him. Yes, that's true, you know. She goes closer to him, wonderingly. I don't understand about you. Inspector, calmly. There's no reason why you should. He regards her calmly, while she stares at him wonderingly and dubiously. Now Mrs. Burling enters, briskly and self-confidently, quite out of key, with the little scene that has just passed. Sheila feels this at once. Mrs. Burling, smiling, social. Good evening, Inspector. Inspector. Good evening, madam. Mrs. Burling, same easy tone. I'm Miss Burling, you know. My husband has just explained you're here. And while I will be glad to tell you anything you want to know, I don't think we can help you much. Sheila, no, mother, please. Mrs. Burling, affecting great surprise. What's the matter, Sheila? Sheila, hesitantly. I know it sounds silly. Mrs. Burling, what does? Sheila, you see, I feel you're beginning all wrong, and I'm afraid you'll say something or do something that you'll be sorry for afterwards. Mrs. Burling, I don't know what you're talking about, Sheila. Sheila, we all started like that, so confident, so pleased with ourselves, until he began asking us questions. Mrs. Burling looks from Sheila to the inspector. Mrs. Burling, you seem to have made a great impression on this child, Inspector. Inspector, coolly. We often do on the young ones. They're more impressionable. He and Mrs. Burling look at each other for a moment. Then Mrs. Burling turns to Sheila again. Mrs. Burling, you're looking tired, dear. I think you ought to go to bed. And forget about this absurd business. You'll feel better in the morning. Sheila, Mother, I couldn't possibly go. Nothing could be worse for me. We've settled all that. I'm staying here until I know why the girl killed herself. Mrs. Burling, nothing but morbid curiosity. Sheila, no it isn't. Mrs. Burling, please don't contradict me like that. And in any case, I don't suppose for a moment that we can understand why the girl committed suicide. Girls of that class. Sheila, urgently cutting in. Mother, don't. Please don't. For your own sake, as well as ours. You mustn't. Mrs. Burling, annoyed. Mustn't what? Really, Sheila? Sheila, slowly, carefully now. You mustn't try to build up a kind of wall between us and that girl. If you do, then the inspector will just break it down, and it'll be all the worse when he does. Mrs. Burling, I don't understand you. To Inspector, do you? Inspector, yes, and she's right. Mrs. Burling, haughtily, I beg your pardon? Inspector, very plainly, I said yes, I do understand her. And she's right. Mrs. Burling, that, I consider, is a trifle impertinent, Inspector. Sheila gives short, hysterical laugh. No, what is it, Sheila? Sheila, I don't know. Perhaps it's because impertinent is such a silly word. Mrs. Burling, in any case. Sheila, but mother, do stop before it's too late. Mrs. Burling, if you mean that, the inspector will take offence. Inspector, cutting in calmly. No, I never take offence. Mrs. Burling, I'm glad to hear it, though I must add that it seems to me that we have more reason for taking offence. Inspector, let's leave offence out of it, shall we? Gerald, I think we'd better. Sheila, so do I. Mrs. Burling, rebuking them. I'm talking to the inspector now, if you don't mind. the inspector rather grandly. I realize that you may have to conduct some sort of inquiry, but I must say that so far you seem to conducting it in a rather peculiar and offensive manner. You know, of course, that my husband was Lord Mayor only 2 years ago, and that he is still a magistrate. Gerald, cutting in rather impatiently. Mrs. Burling, the inspector knows all that, and I don't think it's a very good idea to remind him. Sheila, cutting in. It's crazy. Stop it, please, Mother. Inspector, imperturbable. Yes. Now what about Mr. Burling? Mrs. Burling. He's coming back in a moment. He's just talking to my son, Eric, who seems to be in an excitable, silly mood. Inspector. What's the matter with him? Mrs. Burling. Eric? Oh, I'm afraid he may have had a rather too much to drink tonight. We were having a little celebration here. Inspector, cutting in. Isn't he used to drinking? Mrs. Burling. No, of course not. He's only a boy. Inspector. No, he's a young man. And some young men drink far too much. Sheila. And Eric's one of them. Mrs. Burling, very sharply. Sheila! Sheila, urgently. I don't want to get poor Eric into trouble. He's probably in enough trouble already. But we really must stop these silly pretenses. This isn't the time to pretend that Eric isn't used to drink. He's been steadily drinking too much for the last 2 years. Mrs. Burling staggered. It isn't true. You know him, Gerald, and you're a man. You must know it isn't true. Inspector, as Gerald hesitates. Well, Mr. Croft. Gerald, apologetically to Mrs. Burling. I'm afraid it is, you know. Actually, I've never been much of him outside. I've never seen much of him outside this house. But, well, I have gathered that he does drink pretty hard. Mrs. Burling, bitterly. And this is the time you choose to tell me. Sheila, yes, of course it is. That's what I meant when I talked about building up a wall that's sure to be knocked flat. It makes it all the harder to bear. Mrs. Burling, but it's you, and not the inspector here, who's doing it. Sheila, yes, but don't you see? He hasn't started on you yet. Mrs. Burling, after a pause, recovering herself. If necessary, I shall be glad to answer any questions the inspector